Elvis, we have all the flowers and the letters and the cards that you have sent since the passing away of my son.
The call came in on a Tuesday morning in September of 1979. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, had suffered a massive heart attack at his home in Memphis. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. The man who had been present for every major moment of Elvis's life, who had watched his son transform from a truck driver's kid into the most famous entertainer on the planet, who had tried desperately to protect Elvis from the vultures circling around him, was gone. He was only 63 years old. And with his death, a door was supposed to close on certain secrets. But instead, it opened one that nobody expected. When the executor of Vernon's will began the standard process of inventorying his estate, documenting his assets, and organizing his papers for the probate process, they stumbled upon something that should have been impossible to find. Behind a false panel in Vernon's private office at Graceland, concealed in a safe that was built into the wall itself, they discovered a collection of documents that Vernon had been assembling for years. Not casual notes or personal correspondence. These were meticulously organized files containing financial records, letters, photographs, and memoranda that painted a completely different picture of what had been happening to Elvis during his final years. The documents were shocking. They were damning, and they were never supposed to be seen by anyone outside the family. But for a brief moment, before the right people realized what had been found, and before the documents could be secured and controlled, there was a window of time where certain individuals actually saw what Vernon had been documenting. They read the letters. They reviewed the financial statements. They looked at the evidence. And then, almost immediately, measures were taken to ensure that these discoveries remained contained within the family circle, away from the public, away from authorities, and most importantly, away from anyone who might actually do something about what the documents revealed. The question that haunts anyone who examines this moment in history is simple. What was so dangerous about Vernon's collection that his own family felt compelled to hide it? What truths was Vernon documenting that were worth suppressing even after his death? Why would the same people who publicly mourned Vernon's passing also move swiftly to ensure that his final testament, in the form of these hidden documents, never reached the light of day? The answer lies in understanding who Vernon was and what he had realized about the world surrounding his son. Vernon Presley was not a sophisticated man. He didn't have a background in business or law. He was a simple man who had worked hard his entire life, who had raised a son he loved more than anything, and who had watched that son become a commodity. He had watched him be used. And as Elvis's empire grew, as the money poured in from every direction, Vernon began to notice something deeply wrong with the financial machinery that was supposedly managing his son's wealth. In the early 1970s, as Elvis's health began to decline visibly, as his behavior became increasingly erratic, as the people around him grew more controlling and more demanding, Vernon made a decision that would define the final years of his life. He decided to keep a record, not a dramatic gesture, not an attempt at blackmail or leverage, just a father documenting what he was seeing, writing down the things that didn't add up, keeping track of the people who seemed to be prioritizing profit over his son's well-being. Vernon wasn't stupid. He understood that Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, had legal contracts and leverage that Vernon himself didn't possess. He knew that the doctors surrounding Elvis had credentials and authority that gave them power over medical decisions that Vernon couldn't override. He recognized that Priscilla, even as Elvis's ex-wife, maintained a surprising amount of influence over Elvis's life and choices. Vernon understood the machinery of control that had been constructed around his son. But what he couldn't do was break it. What he could do was document it. And so Vernon accumulated evidence. He collected copies of financial documents that showed suspicious transactions, He kept records of conversations where people lied to Elvis about his own health and his own money. He documented the names and the dates and the specific instances where he witnessed people prioritizing their own interests over Elvis's well-being. And then, when he had assembled enough documentation, enough proof, enough evidence to potentially change things, he placed it in a safe and he kept it secret. He was waiting for the right moment. He was waiting for a time when Elvis might be ready to hear the truth, or when the evidence might be needed in a legal proceeding, or when circumstances might finally align in a way that would allow him to actually protect his son. But that moment never came. Vernon died before he could use the evidence, and in the days and weeks that followed his death, as his estate was being processed and his belongings were being inventoried, the people who had been the subjects of his documentation realized that something dangerous had been left behind. Something that could expose them. Something that could unravel the carefully constructed narrative they had spent years building. What happened next became the real tragedy of the Presley family. Instead of Vernon's evidence being treated as the serious documentation of potential crimes, instead of it being turned over to authorities or lawyers who might have pursued justice, it was systematically contained. Some of it disappeared entirely. Some of it was allegedly destroyed. Some of it was allegedly paid for, compensated for, made to go away in exchange for silence. And the people who had been closest to Vernon, the people who should have honored his dying wish to protect the truth, instead made calculated decisions to protect themselves and the reputations of the very people Vernon had been trying to expose. This is where the story should have ended, with Vernon's evidence buried, with his warnings ignored, with his documentation of corruption safely contained within the family vault. But 50 years later, questions are finally being asked. People who were there are finally speaking up. And the documents that Vernon so carefully preserved are finally starting to resurface, piece by piece, fragment by fragment, forcing a reckoning that Vernon never lived to see. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. Vernon Presley spent the last decade of his life watching his son disappear. Not physically, though Elvis's appearance certainly changed in those years, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually, Elvis was vanishing into a fog that no amount of love could penetrate. And Vernon, helpless to stop it, began the slow process of documenting everything he was witnessing. He became a detective in his own son's life, writing down observations that nobody else seemed to notice or care about. He was trying to build a case, though he wasn't entirely sure who the judge would be or when the trial would finally happen. The documents Vernon accumulated painted a portrait of systematic exploitation that goes far beyond the popular understanding of Elvis's demise. Most people believe Elvis died because he was addicted to prescription drugs. That's the official narrative. That's the comfortable story. But Vernon's papers suggested something more calculated, more orchestrated, more deliberately destructive. Vernon documented instances where Colonel Parker made financial decisions that directly contradicted Elvis's stated wishes. He kept records of conversations where Parker told Elvis something was absolutely necessary, absolutely required, absolutely in Elvis's best interest, when Vernon could see with his own eyes that the opposite was true. Parker had total control over Elvis's career by this point. He controlled which movies Elvis would make, which concerts he would perform, which recording sessions he would attend, and more importantly, he controlled the money. Vernon began to notice that Elvis was making extraordinary amounts of money, record-breaking amounts, historic amounts, but Elvis himself seemed perpetually short of cash. He would complain about not having enough money for things he wanted to do. He would talk about financial constraints. about being unable to make certain purchases or take certain trips. And Vernon realized that the disconnect between what Elvis was earning and what Elvis actually had access to was staggering. Vernon started tracking the payments. He began collecting copies of contracts, agreements, and financial statements. What he discovered was that Colonel Parker had negotiated a deal structure that was absolutely devastating to Elvis's long-term financial health. Parker took massive percentages of Elvis's earnings. Parker charged Elvis exorbitant fees for services that seemed fraudulent or unnecessary. Parker had inserted himself into virtually every revenue stream connected to Elvis's name and image. The Colonel wasn't just managing Elvis, he was bleeding him dry. And he was doing it with Elvis's signature on documents that Elvis probably didn't fully understand. But the financial exploitation was only part of what Vernon was documenting. The other part was medical, and it was far more disturbing. Vernon began to notice a pattern with the doctors who surrounded Elvis. Dr. George Nicopolis, who became Elvis's personal physician in the early 1970s, seemed to have an inexplicable solution to every problem Elvis experienced. Feeling anxious? Here's a prescription. Can't sleep? Here's another prescription. Feeling tired during the day? Here's an upper to combat the downer you took last night. And then here's another medication to manage the side effects of the first medication. Vernon watched as Elvis became increasingly dependent on these prescriptions. He watched his son's behavior become more erratic, more paranoid, more isolated. He listened as Elvis complained about tremors in his hands, about digestive problems, about chest pains, and every time Elvis mentioned a symptom, Dr. Nick had another pill. Vernon began to question whether this was medicine or whether it was something else entirely. Whether Dr. Nick was actually trying to help Elvis or whether he was deliberately keeping Elvis medicated in a way that made him compliant, manageable, and unable to think clearly enough to question what was happening to him. Vernon started documenting the prescriptions. He kept records of what was being prescribed, in what quantities, and how frequently. He noted the dates when Elvis seemed particularly unwell, particularly medicated, particularly unable to function. And he observed that the people around Elvis seemed to prefer him in this state. A drugged Elvis was a predictable Elvis. A medicated Elvis couldn't ask uncomfortable questions. An Elvis who was confused by pharmaceutical cocktails couldn't effectively challenge Colonel Parker's financial arrangements or question the decisions being made on his behalf. What makes Vernon's documentation so compelling is that he wasn't a conspiracy theorist or a paranoid fantasist. He was a father who loved his son and who was observing cause and effect with clarity. He wasn't accusing anyone of deliberately trying to kill Elvis. He was documenting a system, a pattern, a deliberate strategy to keep Elvis dependent, isolated, and incapable of protecting himself. And he was gathering evidence because he believed that at some point, this system could be dismantled, and Elvis could be rescued from it. Vernon also documented the role that certain family members played in maintaining the exploitation. He noted how Priscilla, despite being Elvis's ex-wife, maintained significant influence over Elvis's personal decisions. He recorded instances where Priscilla would reinforce the narratives that kept Elvis trapped. She would tell him that he couldn't survive without the system that was destroying him. She would threaten to keep Lisa Marie away from him if he tried to break free from Colonel Parker or fire Dr. Nick. Vernon documented how Priscilla used emotional leverage to keep Elvis compliant with arrangements that were clearly harmful to him. What haunts anyone who examines Vernon's papers is the sense of a father who understood exactly what was happening and felt completely powerless to stop it. Vernon couldn't fire Colonel Parker because Parker had legal authority that Vernon didn't possess. Vernon couldn't remove Dr. Nick because Elvis had the right to choose his own physicians. Vernon couldn't force Priscilla to stop interfering because she had leverage through Lisa Marie. Vernon had moral authority and nothing else. So he did what he could do. He documented, he recorded, he He preserved evidence, and he placed it in a safe, hoping that someday, somehow, the truth would matter more than the comfortable lies that were protecting the people who were destroying his son. When Vernon's safe was opened in the weeks following his death, the people who had access to it were immediately confronted with a problem. The documents inside were not casual family memorabilia or sentimental letters. They were evidence. They were financial documentation of what appeared to be systematic embezzlement. They were medical records that suggested deliberate over-medication. They were correspondence that implicated powerful people in the exploitation of Elvis Presley. And the moment certain family members realized what Vernon had left behind, a decision was made that would echo through history. These documents could not become public, they could not reach authorities, they could not be preserved as historical evidence. They had to disappear. According to multiple sources who claim to have witnessed the contents of Vernon's safe during that brief window when it was first opened, there were specific documents that were particularly damaging. Financial ledgers that detailed Colonel Parker's embezzlement from Elvis's accounts, medical records from Dr. Nick that showed prescription patterns that defied any legitimate medical explanation, letters from business associates warning Vernon that people in Elvis's inner circle were systematically robbing him blind, correspondence between Parker and other managers discussing Elvis's value as a commodity and how to maximize profit extraction before Elvis became unusable. But here's what's crucial to understand about what happened next. Not all of those documents still exist. Some of them vanished. Some of them were allegedly destroyed. Some of them were allegedly paid for by people who had financial incentive to make them disappear. There is credible testimony from people who were present that Priscilla Presley was directly involved in ensuring that certain documents never reached the public domain. Whether she destroyed them herself or whether she coordinated with others to have them destroyed is a matter of dispute. But there is little dispute that she had motive and opportunity, and that certain documents that were documented as existing in Vernon's safe are now gone without explanation. The financial documents are particularly significant because they would have answered one of the central questions that has haunted Elvis historians for decades. How much money did Colonel Parker actually steal from Elvis? The answer, according to people who claim to have seen the documents, is staggering. We're talking about amounts that would be equivalent to hundreds of millions in modern currency. We're talking about systematic theft that went on for decades. We're talking about a financial arrangement that was so exploitative that it would have been prosecutable as fraud if it had ever reached a courtroom. But it never reached a courtroom. Instead, what happened after Vernon's safe was discovered was that a series of conversations took place within the Presley family circle. Conversations about how to handle the situation. Conversations about what needed to be protected and what could be exposed. And according to evidence and testimony, deals were made. Settlements were reached. Agreements were struck where certain people agreed to remain silent about what was in Vernon's safe in exchange for financial compensation or continued access to the Presley financial machinery. The medical records present an equally disturbing picture. According to people who examined the documentation Vernon had assembled, Dr. Nick's prescription patterns were not just excessive. They were deliberately designed to keep Elvis in a state of pharmaceutical dependency. The dosages were increasing over time, the combinations of medications were becoming more dangerous, and the frequency of prescriptions was accelerating. But instead of this evidence being used to hold Dr. Nick accountable, instead of it being reported to medical boards or law enforcement, it was allegedly contained. It was kept secret. It was protected by the very family that should have been pursuing justice on behalf of Elvis. What makes this containment so sinister is that it suggests a calculated decision by the Presley family to prioritize reputation and continued access to financial resources over truth and accountability. They had evidence of crimes. They had documentation of exploitation. They had proof of medical malpractice. And they chose to bury it rather than confront it. They chose to protect the perpetrators rather than expose them. They chose to maintain the silence rather than break it. There's also evidence that the cover-up extended beyond simply hiding documents. There's testimony that people actively worked to discredit or intimidate anyone who tried to raise questions about what had happened to Elvis or what was happening to the Presley estate. Journalists who started investigating the financial irregularities found their stories killed by publications that had financial ties to the Presley family or Colonel Parker's interests. Researchers who wanted to examine Elvis's medical records encountered obstacles and restrictions. Anybody who tried to dig deeper into what was really going on was met with legal threats or financial pressure. What's particularly damning is that some of the people who made decisions to contain Vernon's evidence are still alive. Some of them are still wealthy. Some of them are still influential, and they have had 50 years to ensure that the narrative they preferred remained intact. They have had 50 years to shape the public understanding of Elvis's death as a tragic accident rather than as the inevitable outcome of systematic exploitation. They have had 50 years to make sure that their roles in the destruction of Elvis Presley remained hidden or minimized or reframed in ways that protect their legacies. The tragedy is that Vernon left behind a roadmap. He documented the names of the people who were harming his son. He provided evidence of the crimes that were being committed. He created a historical record that could have changed everything. But that record was suppressed. It was hidden. It was allegedly destroyed. And the people responsible for suppressing it have lived their entire lives knowing what they did, knowing what they buried, knowing what they chose to protect rather than expose. Now, decades later, questions are being asked again. People are wondering what happened to Vernon's documents. Researchers are trying to track down the pieces of evidence that have survived, and the Presley family, through its current trustee, is facing pressure to finally release what remains of Vernon's documentation. The question is whether they will. Whether they will finally honor Vernon's dying wish to bring the truth to light, or whether they will continue the tradition of silence that began the moment that safe was opened in September of 1979. The true significance of Vernon's safe doesn't lie in what was found inside it. It lies in what those findings mean when you connect them to everything else that happened to Elvis Presley. Because when you take the financial evidence Vernon documented, and you combine it with the medical evidence he preserved, and you add in the timeline of Elvis's deterioration, and you factor in the people who had motive and opportunity to accelerate that deterioration, a very different picture emerges from the official narrative. It's a picture that the Presley family has spent 50 years trying to suppress. Let's be clear about what Vernon's documents actually proved. They proved that Colonel Parker was stealing from Elvis on a systematic, ongoing basis. They proved that Dr. Nick was prescribing medications in quantities and combinations that served no legitimate medical purpose. They proved that people in Elvis's inner circle knew exactly what was happening and were benefiting from it. But more importantly, they suggested something far more sinister. They suggested that once Elvis became a legal liability, once the evidence of theft and malpractice was piling up, once Elvis started asking dangerous questions about where his money was going, he became more valuable dead than alive. This isn't speculation. This is documented concern that Vernon expressed in his papers. Vernon wrote about conversations where people around Elvis seemed more interested in maintaining the status quo than in actually helping Elvis get better. He documented instances where Elvis tried to get clean, tried to fire people who were exploiting him, tried to take control of his own life, and was systematically prevented from doing so. Vernon noted that every time Elvis tried to escape the system, the people controlling him found new ways to trap him deeper. What makes this pattern so disturbing is that it suggests a possible motive for hastening Elvis's death. Not in the sense of a dramatic murder plot, but in the sense of a system that continued functioning exactly as it had been functioning, knowing that it was killing Elvis, knowing that the alternative was losing control over him and facing potential prosecution. A living, healthy Elvis who broke free from the system would have been a disaster for Colonel Parker, for Dr. Nick, for everyone who had built their lives on exploiting him. A dead Elvis, on the other hand, became immortal. A dead Elvis became a legend that could be controlled and monetized indefinitely. Vernon understood this dynamic. He documented it. And he recognized that the system surrounding his son was designed to extract maximum value regardless of the cost to Elvis himself. Vernon knew that his son was being poisoned, both literally through the medications and figuratively through the control and isolation. He knew that Elvis was trapped, and he knew that unless something changed dramatically, Elvis would not survive it. What happened after Vernon's death was the system protecting itself. The people who benefited from Elvis's exploitation realized that Vernon had left behind evidence that could expose them. So, they made a choice. They chose to protect themselves rather than to pursue justice for Elvis. They chose to bury Vernon's evidence rather than act on it. And in doing so, they became complicit in covering up the crimes that Vernon had documented. The financial aspects of this cover-up are particularly revealing. According to people who have examined what remains of Vernon's documentation, there were deliberate attempts to buy silence. Money was allegedly paid to certain people in exchange for their agreement not to speak publicly about what they knew or what they had seen in Vernon's safe. These weren't small amounts of money. These were significant financial payments designed to ensure that people kept their mouths shut. This is the definition of obstruction of justice. This is the definition of conspiracy. But it was never prosecuted because the very people who should have been investigating it were either benefiting from the cover-up or were too intimidated by the Presley family's power to act. The medical cover-up is equally damaging. Dr. Nick continued practicing medicine for decades after Vernon's death. He continued treating patients. He continued receiving compensation from the Presley estate. He continued being treated as a respectable physician despite the evidence that Vernon had documented about his reckless prescribing practices. Nobody reported him to the medical board. Nobody pursued charges of medical malpractice. Nobody held him accountable for the role he played in Elvis's deterioration. The system protected him because protecting him was easier than confronting what he had done. And then there's the question of what Elvis himself might have done if he had lived to see Vernon's evidence presented. What would Elvis have done if he had finally understood the full scope of the theft, the manipulation, and the deliberate harm that was being inflicted on him? Would he have sued Colonel Parker? Would he have fired Dr. Nick? Would he have broken free from the control that was suffocating him? We'll never know because Elvis died before Vernon could present his case. This is where the story becomes truly tragic. Vernon left behind not just evidence, but a blueprint for rescue. He documented exactly what was happening and exactly who was responsible. He preserved information that could have allowed Elvis to break free from the system that was destroying him. But the opportunity was lost. And then the evidence was buried. Now, nearly 50 years later, those documents are starting to resurface. Researchers are uncovering pieces of what Vernon left behind. People who were present when the safe was opened are finally speaking up, and questions are being asked that the Presley family has been avoiding for half a century. What exactly was in Vernon's safe? What documents were destroyed and why? Who authorized the cover-up? And what would Elvis's life have looked like if Vernon's evidence had been acted upon instead of suppressed? Riley Keough, as the current trustee of the Presley estate, now holds the keys to whatever remains of Vernon's documentation. She has access to the safe, she knows what's in the family archives, she understands the implications of what her great-grandfather was trying to preserve, and she faces an impossible choice. She can continue the tradition of silence that has protected her family from legal liability and public scrutiny for 50 years. Or she can finally honor Vernon's dying wish and release the evidence that could fundamentally change how the world understands Elvis's death. The choice she makes will determine whether Vernon's attempt to protect his son succeeds 50 years too late, or whether Elvis's exploitation remains buried with him forever. Vernon Presley died trying to expose the truth. His safe held the evidence, but will Riley finally release it? Will the Presley family finally break their silence? Subscribe now, because what happens next could shake the entertainment industry to its core.